The Tennessee sun hung like a malevolent eye over the Whitmore plantation, its July heat pressing down upon the cotton fields with the weight of divine judgment. Even at dawn, the air shimmered with a suffocating humidity that clung to skin like wet burial shrouds. In the distance, thunder rumbled without promise of rain, just another empty threat from a merciless sky. Caleb wiped the sweat from his brow as he bent over the cotton plants, his weathered hands moving with the mechanical precision born of 23 years in bondage. At 35, his back carried the permanent curve of a man who had spent his life bowing to another's will, but his eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, held depths that his captors had never managed to fathom. The crack of a whip split the morning air like thunder. "Move faster, you worthless dogs!" Ezekiel Harrow's voice carried across the field with the venom of a copperhead strike. "The cotton won't pick itself, and Master Whitmore expects his quota to be filled by sundown." Harrow sat astride his chestnut mare, a thin man with pale, sickly skin that seemed to reject the Tennessee sun. His narrow face was pinched with perpetual cruelty, and his pale blue eyes gleamed with the particular madness of a man who had discovered that causing pain was the only thing that made him feel truly alive. The leather whip coiled in his right hand like a sleeping serpent, always ready to strike. "Yes, sir, Mr. Harrow," came the mumbled chorus from the workers, their voices carrying the practiced submission of people who had learned that defiance meant death. But Caleb noticed something else in those voices, a tremor that hadn't been there the week before. Fear, yes, but something darker, something that tasted of iron and retribution. Sarah moved through the rows nearby, her calico dress clinging to her slight frame in the oppressive heat. At 28, she possessed a quiet beauty that the horrors of plantation life had not quite managed to extinguish, though new lines had appeared around her brown eyes in recent months. She caught Caleb's gaze and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the far end of the field, where old Moses worked alone. Moses was bent nearly double, his ancient hands trembling as they pulled cotton from the bolls. At 72, he should have been relegated to lighter duties, but Harrow seemed to take particular pleasure in watching the old man suffer. Moses had been on the Whitmore plantation longer than anyone. Longer, some whispered, than the Whitmores themselves. He remembered things, old things, and lately he had been muttering words in languages that predated the arrival of white men to these Tennessee hills. "Sarah!" Harrow's voice cracked like a pistol shot. "Get over here, girl!" Sarah's step faltered for just a moment, a hesitation so brief that only someone watching closely would have noticed. But Caleb was watching, and he saw the way her hands clenched into fists before she smoothed her expression into the blank mask that meant survival. "Yes, sir?" Harrow dismounted with the fluid grace of a predator. He was a thin man, but there was a wiry strength in his movements that spoke of years, spent breaking things, horses, tools, people. His pale eyes traveled over Sarah with an hunger that made Caleb's stomach turn. "You've been talking to others during work time?" Harrow's voice was deceptively soft, the way a cat's purr might sound just before it struck. "No, sir. Just working, like you told us." "Like I told you." Harrow repeated the words slowly as if tasting them. "See, that's what I like to hear, Sarah. Obedience, respect." He circled her slowly, and Caleb saw the way the other workers had gone still, their attention focused on the drama unfolding while they tried to appear invisible. Harrow stopped directly behind Sarah. "But see, I've been watching you, girl. Watching the way you look at folks, the way you move your lips when you think nobody's seeing. Almost like you got something to say that you don't want me hearing." "No, sir, nothing like that." The blow came without warning, a backhanded strike that sent Sarah stumbling sideways into the cotton plants. She caught herself on trembling arms, blood trickling from her split lip, but she didn't cry out. She had learned long ago that tears only made men like Harrow hungrier. "Don't you lie to me, girl." Harrow's voice had dropped to a whisper, but somehow it carried across the field more clearly than his shouts. "I can smell lies on you like I can smell the stink of this field. You've been talking, whispering, planning." He was right, of course. They had all been talking, whispering, planning. But not the kind of planning he imagined. What grew in the sill? Hearts of the Whitmore plantation's enslaved workers was something far older and more terrible than simple escape. Sarah pulled herself upright, wiping blood from her mouth with the back of her hand. "I ain't done nothing wrong, Mr. Harrow." "Nothing wrong." Harrow laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Well, we'll see about that." He remounted his horse and rode slowly through the rows, his pale eyes moving from worker to worker like a hawk searching for wounded prey. When he reached Moses, he stopped. "You, old man, you've been filling these folks' heads with your heathen nonsense again?" Moses didn't look up from his cotton. His gnarled hands continued their work with steady determination. "Just picking cotton, sir, like every day." "Like every day," Harrow repeated. "But it ain't like every day, is it, Moses? Something's different, something's changed." He leaned forward in his saddle. "The very air tastes different, feels different, like something's coming." And he was right about that too. Something was coming. Caleb had felt it building for weeks now, a pressure in the air that had nothing to do with weather. The other workers felt it too. It showed in the way they moved, the way they looked at each other, the way their voices dropped to whispers when they spoke of certain things. It showed in the cotton itself. 3 days ago, Caleb had found the first black boll, a cotton bloom so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. By yesterday, there were dozens scattered throughout the field, growing alongside the normal white cotton like cancerous growths. When touched, they felt cold despite the blazing heat, and they left a strange residue on the fingers that no amount of washing could remove. The other workers had begun to whisper about signs and portents. Sarah, whose grandmother had been born in the old country and had passed down knowledge that predated Christianity, spoke of the land itself crying out for justice. Moses muttered prayers in languages that sounded like wind through dead leaves. And the crows, dozens of them now, had begun gathering at the edges of the fields. They didn't caw or call like normal crows. They simply watched with their black, intelligent eyes as if waiting for something. Harrow seemed oblivious to the supernatural tension that hung over the plantation like a shroud, but he sensed something. It made him more vicious than usual, more prone to sudden violence. Yesterday he had beaten young Timothy nearly to death for the crime of working too slowly. The boy still lay unconscious in the quarters, tended by the women who whispered prayers and mixed herbs by candlelight. "I'm watching you all," Harrow announced, his voice carrying across the field. "Every last one of you. And when I find out what you're plotting, because I will find out, the punishment will be biblical." He wheeled his horse around and rode toward the big house, leaving behind him a field full of workers who moved like sleepwalkers through their tasks. But in their eyes, in their careful, guarded eyes, something new had taken root, something that had grown tired of waiting. Caleb returned to his cotton, but his hands moved automatically while his mind wandered to darker thoughts. Sarah caught his eye again and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the woods at the far edge of the field. Later, after the sun went down and Harrow retired to his bottle of corn whiskey, they would gather. They would talk. They would plan. And in the cotton around them, more black bolls bloomed like bruises against the white, while overhead the crows circled in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic, and the very air seemed to thicken with the weight of approaching judgment. The day was young, but already it carried the taste of ending things. Thunder rumbled again in the distance, and this time it sounded almost like laughter. The heat of that July morning was only the beginning. As the sun climbed higher and the tension thickened like molasses, the workers of the Whitmore plantation found themselves standing at the edge of something terrible and necessary. But what dark forces were truly at work in those Tennessee cotton fields? And what price would justice ultimately demand? If you're drawn into this tale of supernatural vengeance, subscribe and let us know in the comments what you think is causing those black cotton bolls to appear. The story is just beginning, and the darkness is only going to grow deeper. The moon hung low and bloated over the Tennessee hills that night, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. In the quarters, a collection of ramshackle cabins that housed the Whitmore plantation's enslaved workers, oil lamps flickered behind shuttered windows, and whispered conversations carried on the humid air like prayers to dark gods. Caleb moved silently between the buildings, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. He had learned long ago how to become invisible when necessary, how to move through shadows like smoke. Tonight, that skill served a purpose more dangerous than simple survival. The door to Moses's cabin stood slightly ajar, and warm lamplight spilled through the crack like honey. Caleb paused, listening to the night sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of something large moving through the cotton fields, the almost inaudible murmur of voices from within the cabin. Then he slipped inside. The cabin was small and sparse, furnished only with a rough wooden table, a few three-legged stools, and a corn-shuck mattress in the corner where Moses slept. But tonight it felt sacred, like a temple where terrible decisions were made by desperate people. Sarah sat on one of the stools, her face partially hidden in shadow. The split lip Harrow had given her that morning had swollen, giving her words a slight lisp that somehow made them more ominous. Beside her, old Moses hunched over the table, his gnarled fingers tracing patterns in spilled cornmeal, while he muttered words that predated the arrival of Christianity to these hills. "Is the boy still breathing?" Caleb asked, settling onto the remaining stool. "Barely," Sarah replied. "Rebecca's with him, trying to keep the fever down, but his back—" She shook her head. Harrow opened him up good this time, like he was trying to fillet a fish. Timothy was only 16, barely more than a child. Yesterday, Harrow had beaten him with a hickory switch for the crime of pausing to wipe sweat from his eyes. The beating had continued long past the point of punishment and well into the realm of sadistic entertainment. By the time it ended, Timothy's back looked like raw meat, and his screams had echoed across the plantation like the wails of the damned. "He won't be the last," Moses said, without looking up from his patterns in the cornmeal. "Harrow's got a taste for it now, got a hunger that can't be satisfied with just cruelty. He wants to break something permanent-like." "Then we break him first," Caleb said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Moses finally looked up, his ancient eyes reflecting the lamplight like pools of dark water. "You sure about this path, boy? Once we start walking down this road, ain't no turning back. Ain't no forgiveness on the other side." "Forgiveness?" Sarah's voice carried a bitter edge. "From who? The Lord Almighty? The same God who's been watching Harrow torture us for 3 years without lifting a finger? The same God who let them drag us from our homes and sell us like cattle?" "Hush, girl," Moses said, but his tone was gentle. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Maybe he's been preparing us for this moment all along. Maybe this is his justice coming through our hands." Caleb leaned forward. "You've been having the dreams again. It wasn't a question." For the past 2 weeks, Moses had been waking the entire quarters with his nighttime visions, prophecies delivered in languages that belonged to his African ancestors, warnings spoken in tongues that made the very air seem to thicken with power. Every night, Moses admitted. The same vision over and over, the white death, covering him like a shroud. The earth itself swallows his screams. And the fields. He paused, his eyes growing distant. The fields singing with voices of the dead, calling for justice that's been too long delayed. Sarah reached into the small leather pouch she wore around her neck, a collection of herbs and bones and other things that had been passed down from her grandmother. She withdrew a small object wrapped in black cloth and placed it carefully on the table. "Granny left me more than just plant wisdom," she said softly. "She left me knowledge, old knowledge, the kind that came across the water in the bellies of ships, hidden in the memories of women who refused to let their power be chained." She unwrapped the object, revealing a small doll made from corn husks and cotton fibers. It was roughly humanoid, in shape, but there was something unsettling about its proportions, something that suggested it had been crafted by hands guided by purposes older than Christianity. "What is it?" Caleb asked, though part of him already knew. "A way to focus on what's already building," Sarah replied. "The land's angry, Caleb. Can't you feel it? The very soil is crying out for justice. Those black cotton bolls ain't natural, they're signs, omens. The earth itself is showing us that the time for waiting is over." As if summoned by her words, a sound drifted through the cabin walls, the distant cawing of crows. But it wasn't the normal sound of birds roosting for the night. This was different, rhythmic, almost like chanting. Moses stood and moved to the shuttered window, peering out through the cracks. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "There must be hundreds of them out there." Caleb joined him at the window. In the moonlight, he could see them, black shapes perched on the rooflines of the quarters, covering the ground like a living carpet. Their eyes reflected the moonlight like tiny stars, and they were perfectly still except for the occasional ruffle of feathers. "They're waiting for something," Caleb observed. "They're waiting for us to decide," Sarah corrected. She had moved, to stand behind the doll, her hands hovering over it like a minister blessing communion wine. "The question is, are we going to let Timothy die slowly and then watch Harrow pick off the rest of us one by one? Or are we going to do what needs doing?" The room fell silent except for the distant sound of the crows and Timothy's labored breathing from the cabin next door. Each of them understood that this moment would define the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives might be. Finally, Caleb spoke. "What would you need us to do?" Sarah's hands settled on the doll, and immediately the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Harrow has patterns, routines. Every Tuesday and Friday he inspects the cotton storage barn alone, checks the scales, counts the bales, makes his reports for Master Whitmore. He's always by himself for at least an hour." "Go on." "The barn has that loading platform on the second level, where they store the pressed bales before shipping. Lots of cotton up there. Lots of ways for a man to get lost." Moses returned to the table, his expression grave. "You talking about murder, girl? Cold-blooded murder?" "I'm talking about justice," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm talking about stopping a mad dog before he kills us all." "And after?" Moses pressed. "What happens when they find his body? You think Master Whitmore is just going to shrug and hire a new overseer? They'll hang every last one of us." Sarah's smile was cold and terrible. "Who says they'll find a body?" The implications of her words settled over them like a shroud. Outside, the crows had begun to stir, their cawing growing more insistent, more demanding. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "Those black cotton balls, they ain't just appearing random-like. I have been watching, mapping where they show. Up, they're forming a pattern, a shape." "What kind of shape?" Caleb asked. "The kind that calls to old powers, the kind that opens doors between the world of the living and the world of the dead." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "My granny taught me that some people, when they die violently and full of hate, they don't stay buried properly, they come back, they haunt. And if we do this thing right, if we use the old ways, Harrow's death won't be the end of his punishment. It'll be the beginning." Thunder rumbled overhead, closer than before. Through the window, Caleb could see storm clouds building on the horizon, pregnant with rain that the parched fields desperately needed. But somehow he doubted that what was coming would bring relief. "Friday," he said finally. "Day after tomorrow. We will do it then." Moses nodded slowly, resignation settling over his ancient features like dust. "Then I better start preparing. If we're going to call on powers older than memory, we're going to need protection. And prayers. Lot of prayers." Sarah wrapped the doll back in its black cloth, but not before Caleb noticed that its cornhusk face seemed to have taken on a disturbing resemblance to Ezekiel Harrow. "I'll handle the practical side," she said, "but we'll need everyone to play their part perfectly. One mistake, one person breaking character, and we're all dancing from ropes come Sunday morning." As if in response to her words, a new sound joined the chorus of crows outside. The distant howl of something that might have been wind, but sounded disturbingly like voices. Voices crying for justice, for vengeance, for an end to suffering that had gone on too long. The three conspirators sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own dark thoughts. Finally, Caleb stood to leave. "One more thing," Sarah said as he reached the door. "Once we start this, there's no going back. What we're planning to do, it ain't just killing. It's calling on forces that don't distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. If we open this door, we might not be able to close it again." Caleb paused, his hand on the rough wooden door handle. Then we better make sure we do it right the first time. He slipped out into the night, leaving Sarah and Moses to their preparations. As he made his way back to his own cabin, he noticed that the crows had begun to move, flowing across the ground like a black river, always staying just at the edge of his vision. Above him, the storm clouds continued to gather, and in their depths, lightning flickered like the eyes of angry gods. The air tasted of copper and ozone and something else, something that reminded him of grave dirt and old bones. Friday couldn't come soon enough, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the growing storm, came the sound of Timothy's labored breathing, each breath a reminder of why some acts of vengeance were not just justified, but necessary. The seeds of rebellion had been planted in soil watered with blood and tears. Now all that remained was to tend them until they bloomed into something terrible and final. Thursday night brought no respite from the oppressive heat. The air hung thick and motionless, like the breath of some great sleeping beast, and even the usual chorus of crickets and nightbirds had fallen silent. In the cotton fields, something moved between the rows. Not the wind, for there was no wind, but something else, something that made the white bowls tremble and whisper secrets. To the darkness, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay on his corn-shuck mattress, staring up at the rough wooden ceiling of his cabin while sweat pooled in the hollow of his throat. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow they would spring their trap. But tonight, the very air seemed to vibrate with unnatural energy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A soft knock at his door made him sit up sharply. 3 soft taps, then 2, then 3 again, the signal they had agreed upon. He padded to the door and opened it just wide enough to see Sarah's face in the moonlight. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "You need to come see." He followed her, out into the night, noting how the shadow seemed deeper than usual, how the moonlight appeared to be absorbed by the darkness rather than illuminating it. They moved silently through the quarters, past cabins where people lay sleepless in the heat, past the cabin where Timothy still fought his fever with Rebecca maintaining her vigil. Sarah led him toward the cotton fields, but stopped at the edge, where the cultivated rows met the wild growth at the plantation's border. She pointed without speaking. The black cotton bolls had multiplied exponentially since the previous evening. What had been scattered dark spots among the white were now forming clear patterns, geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. Lines and curves that connected across multiple rows, creating symbols that hurt to look at directly. "It started just after midnight," Sarah whispered. "I couldn't sleep, so I came out to gather some night-blooming herbs for Timothy's fever. That's when I saw them changing." "Changing how?" "Watch." They crouched at the field's edge and waited. At first, Caleb saw nothing unusual beyond the disturbing proliferation of black bolls. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the strange quality of the darkness, he began to notice subtle movements. The cotton plants themselves were swaying, but not in unison. Instead, they moved in slow, deliberate waves that followed the patterns carved by the black bolls, as if invisible hands were conducting some vast, silent orchestra. And there was sound, barely audible, more felt than heard. A low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself, a vibration that made his teeth ache and his skin crawl. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed. "Jesus ain't got nothing to do with this," Sarah replied. "This is older, hungrier. The land's been soaking up blood and tears for generations, and now it's waking up, getting ready to collect what's owed." As if summoned by her words, the humming grew slightly louder, and the cotton plants began to lean toward them like living things seeking attention. In the moonlight, Caleb could swear he saw faces in the shadows between the rows, the faces of the dead watching and waiting. Moses was right about his dreams, Sarah continued. But they weren't just dreams. They were visions, prophecies. The old spirits, the ones who came across the water in chains, they've been building power, preparing for this moment. A new sound joined the humming, a rustling that suggested movement much larger than field mice or possums. Something was walking through the cotton rows, something that moved with the measured pace of a man but left no visible sign of its passage. "We should go," Caleb whispered, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "No. We need to see. We need to understand what we're calling on." The rustling grew closer, and now they could hear breathing, slow, labored, like someone walking through deep water. The cotton plants parted without visible cause, creating a corridor that led directly toward their hiding place. Then they saw him. Ezekiel Harrow walked down the corridor of cotton, but this was not the Harrow they knew. This version moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. His pale skin had taken on a grayish cast that made him look like a corpse, and his eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all, but most disturbing was his mouth. It hung open as he walked, and from it came the humming sound they had been hearing, not from his throat but from somewhere much deeper, as if something else was using his voice box to communicate across vast distances. "That ain't really him," Sarah whispered, but her voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. The Harrow thing stopped directly in front of them, though its black eyes seemed to be looking through them rather than at them. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. "Soon," it said, and the words seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. "Soon the debts will be paid. Soon the ground will drink deep." It turned and walked back through the cotton, the plants closing behind it like water. Within moments, the sound of its breathing faded, and the humming subsided to its previous, barely audible level. "What in God's name was that?" Caleb asked when he finally found his voice. "A warning," Sarah replied. "Or maybe a promise. The boundaries are getting thin. Tomorrow, when we do what needs doing, we won't be acting alone." They made their way back to the quarters in silence, each lost in their own dark thoughts. But as they passed Moses's cabin, they saw lamplight flickering through the cracks in the shutters. The old man was awake, and from within came the sound of singing. Not hymns, but something older and more primal. Words in languages that had been old when the pyramids were young. "He knows," Sarah said. "He can feel it too. The old powers are stirring, getting ready to break through." Caleb paused at his own door. "Are we making a mistake? Calling on things we don't understand?" Sarah's smile was grim. "Maybe. But Harrow's been calling on evil every day for 3 years. At least our devils are honest about what they want." The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, with storm clouds building on the horizon like an advancing army. The air tasted of copper and electricity, and even the plantation's dogs seemed nervous, whining and pacing in their kennels. Harrow appeared for the morning muster, looking haggard and ill-tempered, his pale skin even more sickly than usual. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his hands shook slightly as he gripped his whip. He kept glancing toward the cotton fields with an expression of growing unease, as if seeing things that weren't quite there. "Something's wrong with him," Caleb observed quietly as they formed up for work assignments. "Something's wrong with everything today," replied Marcus, a young man whose back still bore scars from one of Harrow's earlier rampages. "Even the air feels different, heavy-like." As if to emphasize his point, a murder of crows suddenly exploded from the cotton fields, their harsh cries filling the air like an alarm. Harrow spun toward the sound, his whip raised defensively, but the birds simply circled once and settled back into the rows. "What's got into those damn birds?" he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual authority. There was something almost fearful in his tone. The work assignments were distributed with unusual haste, and Harrow seemed eager to conclude the morning ritual and retreat to whatever sanctuary he imagined the overseer's quarters provided. But as the workers dispersed to their tasks, Sarah caught Caleb's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the cotton gin building. It was time for the final preparations. They met Moses in the shadows behind the gin house, where the steady rhythm of the machinery would mask their conversation. The old man looked as though he had aged a decade overnight, his face deeply lined and his hands trembling with more than just palsy. "I've been praying all night," he said without preamble. "Praying to Jesus, to the old gods," my grandmother whispered, to anyone who might be listening. "And you know what I heard back?" "What?" Sarah asked. "Nothing. Just silence. Like the whole world's holding its breath, waiting to see what we do next." "Then we better make sure we do it right," Caleb replied. "Tell me about the barn layout again." Moses drew a rough diagram in the dirt with a stick. Main floor's where they bring the cotton for processing. Second floor's storage. That's where the pressed bales get stacked before shipping. Heavy wooden beams overhead and trapdoors for loading. Harrow always starts his inspection on the main floor, then works his way up. How long between floors? Maybe 10 minutes. He's thorough when he's checking Master Whitmore's property. Counts every bale, examines every scale. Sarah reached into her herb pouch and withdrew a small glass vial filled with dark liquid. This will make him drowsy without making him suspicious, just enough to slow his reflexes. I'll find a way to get it into his morning coffee. And if he doesn't drink it? Moses asked. Then we improvise, Caleb said grimly. But one way or another, Harrow don't walk out of that barn today. As they finalized their plan, the wind began to pick up for the first time in days. But instead of bringing relief from the heat, it carried strange sounds. Whispers that seemed to come from the cotton itself. Voices speaking in languages that predated human memory. "The land knows," Moses said, his voice barely audible above the growing wind. "It's been waiting for this moment. All the blood and tears that's been spilled on this soil, it's all been leading up to today." Above them, the storm clouds continued to build, and in their depths, lightning flickered like the eyes of watching gods. The air pressure was dropping rapidly, making their ears pop and their skin prickle with static electricity. "There's something else," Sarah said as they prepared to separate. "Last night, after we saw whatever that thing was in the field, I had a vision. Saw what's going to happen if we succeed." "And?" Caleb prompted. "Harrow's death won't be the end. It'll be the beginning. What we're unleashing today, it's been building for longer than we know. And once it starts, it might not stop with just him." Moses nodded grimly. "Blood calls to blood. Violence begets violence. The old spirits don't distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. They just want payment for debts too long overdue." "Then we better make sure we're on the right side when the accounting comes due," Caleb said. They clasped hands briefly, a gesture that felt more like a farewell than a promise to meet again. Then they separated, each going to their assigned tasks while the storm clouds gathered overhead and the cotton fields whispered secrets to the wind. In a few hours, Ezekiel Harrow would make his Friday inspection of the cotton storage barn. He would enter as a living man, drunk on power and cruelty. But Sarah's vision had been quite clear about one thing. He would not leave the same way. The cotton was speaking now, telling stories of justice delayed but not denied. And soon, very soon, those stories would have their ending. Friday morning arrived with an ominous stillness that made even the plantation's livestock restless. The promised storm clouds hung overhead like a bruised ceiling, pregnant with lightning, but offering no rain. The air crackled with static electricity that made hair stand on end and metal tools spark when touched. Caleb worked the cotton rows with mechanical precision, but his attention was focused on the overseer's quarters where thin smoke rose from the chimney. Sarah would be in the kitchen now, preparing Harrow's morning coffee with her special addition. Everything depended on timing, on playing their roles perfectly until the moment came to drop their masks. The black cotton bowls had multiplied overnight, forming intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow when observed from the corner of one's eye. The other workers gave these sections wide berths, crossing themselves and muttering prayers when forced to work nearby. Even the most skeptical among them could feel that something unnatural was brewing in the Tennessee soil. Marcus worked the row beside Caleb, his movements jerky with nervous energy. "You feel that?" he whispered. "Like the air's holding its breath?" "Keep working," Caleb replied quietly. "And keep your voice down. Harrow's been watching us closer than usual." It was true. The overseer had been making more frequent passes through the fields, his pale eyes darting constantly from worker to worker as if searching for signs of rebellion. But there was something different about his surveillance today, a manic quality that suggested fear as much as suspicion. Near the main house, Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming cup of coffee on a silver tray. She moved with careful, measured steps, her expression neutral despite the gravity of what she carried. Caleb watched as she approached Harrow, who sat mounted on his horse at the edge of the field. "Your coffee, Mr. Harrow," she said, offering the tray with downcast eyes. Harrow studied her face suspiciously. "Why are you bringing this out here, girl? Usually I take my coffee in the office." "Cook thought you might want it while you supervise." "The workers, sir, said you've been working extra hard keeping watch over us troublemakers." The flattery worked. Harrow's thin lips curved into a cruel smile as he took the cup. "That's right. Can't let you people get too comfortable. Give you an inch, you'll take a mile and burn the whole place down." He drank deeply, smacking his lips, appreciatively. "Tell Cook this is good coffee. Strong. I'll need the energy for my inspection today." Sarah bobbed a curtsy. "Yes, sir. She'll be pleased to hear it." As she walked back toward the kitchen, Caleb caught her eye briefly. She gave the slightest of nods. The deed was done. Within an hour, the herbs would begin taking effect. Nothing dramatic enough to raise suspicion. Just a subtle dulling of reflexes and reaction time. The morning dragged by with agonizing slowness. The sun climbed toward its zenith, but the storm, clouds blocked most of its light, casting the plantation in an eerie twilight that made shadows seem deeper and more threatening. The cotton plants swayed without wind, and the crows had returned in even greater numbers, perching on every available surface like black-robed judges waiting for a verdict. At exactly 11:30, Harrow dismounted and handed his reins to young Marcus. "Take her to the stable and brush her down, and if I find so much as a speck of dust on her when I get back, I'll fly the hide off your worthless back." "Yes, sir, Mr. Harrow." Harrow stretched, rolling his shoulders and working his neck as if fighting stiffness. The herbs were beginning their work. He walked toward the cotton storage barn with slightly less than his usual predatory grace, his steps just a fraction slower than normal. Caleb waited until Harrow disappeared inside the barn, then made his way casually toward the building. Sarah was already there, having slipped away from her kitchen duties under the pretense of gathering eggs from the chickens that roosted near the barn. Moses appeared from the opposite direction, moving with surprising stealth for a man of his advanced years. The barn stood apart from the other plantation buildings, a massive structure of rough-hewn timber and fieldstone that housed the cotton, processing equipment and storage areas. It was here that the plantation's wealth was concentrated, hundreds of pressed cotton bales ready for shipping to the textile mills of New England. "He's on the main floor," Sarah whispered as they gathered, behind the building. "Checking the scales like always. We have maybe 5 minutes before he heads upstairs." Moses pulled a coil of rope from beneath his shirt, thick hemp line that he had been secretly preparing for days. "The support beams up there are solid oak, strong enough to hold considerable weight." "Are you sure about this?" Caleb asked, though he knew it was too late for doubts. "Sure as sin," Moses replied grimly. "That man's been dealing death and misery for 3 years. Time for him to get a taste of his own medicine." They slipped inside through the back entrance, moving like ghosts through the shadows between the cotton bales. The main floor was a maze of equipment and storage areas, all designed to process the white gold that made plantations like Whitmore's profitable. In the distance, they could hear Harrow's voice as he counted bales and made notations in his ledger. A narrow wooden staircase led to the upper storage level, and this was where their trap would be sprung. Sarah had studied the building's layout carefully, noting the trapdoors used for loading cotton bales and the heavy wooden beams that supported the roof. It was perfect for their purposes. Isolated, with plenty of places to conceal evidence of their work, they climbed the stairs silently, the old wood creaking under their weight despite their careful steps. The upper level was dimly lit by small windows set high in the walls, and the air was thick with cotton dust that made their eyes water and their throats burn. Moses immediately went to work with his rope, fashioning a noose with the practiced hands of a man who had once been a sailor before slavery claimed him. The rope was old but strong, and he tested each knot carefully before declaring it ready. "Where do we string it?" Caleb asked. Moses pointed to a massive oak beam that ran the length of the building. "That one there, solid as bedrock and positioned right over the main loading area. Perfect for our purposes." Sarah was examining one of the trap doors, testing its hinges and studying the mechanism that held it closed. This opens onto the main floor. If we position ourselves right, we can drive him toward it. And if he doesn't cooperate, Caleb asked. Then we make him cooperate, Sarah replied, producing a small cotton sack filled with something that clinked metallically, lead shot wrapped in cloth. One good blow to the head should make him more manageable. They worked quickly and efficiently, each knowing their role in the grim theater they were about to perform. Moses secured the rope to the beam and let the noose dangle at chest height. Sarah positioned herself near the trapdoor controls. Caleb took up position near the stairway, ready to block any attempt at escape. Below them, they could hear Harrow's footsteps as he moved through the building, accompanied by the scratch of his pen as he made entries in his ledger. His voice drifted up occasionally, muttering complaints about lazy workers and profit margins. "Getting close to time," Sarah whispered. "He always saves the upper level for last." As if summoned by her words, they heard the overseer's boots on the wooden stairs. He was climbing slowly, more slowly than usual, and they could hear him breathing, harder than normal. The herbs were definitely taking effect. "Remember," Moses whispered urgently, "once this starts, there's no turning back. We do this clean and quick, or we all dance at the end of ropes come Sunday morning." Harrow's head appeared at the top of the stairs, his pale hair disheveled and his face flushed with exertion. He paused at the top, swaying slightly as he fought. The dulling effects of Sarah's potion. "Damn heat," he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. Getting too old for this nonsense. He walked into the storage area, consulting his ledger and beginning his count of the cotton bales. For several minutes he worked methodically, unaware that death itself was watching from the shadows. Then Sarah made her move. She emerged from behind a stack of cotton bales, her expression carefully neutral. "Excuse me, Mr. Harrow?" He spun toward her, his hand instinctively going to the whip at his belt. "What the hell are you doing up here, girl? You're supposed to be in the kitchen." "Cook sent me to find you, sir. Says Master Whitmore wants to see you up at the big house right away. Something about the cotton shipment." Harrow's eyes narrowed, suspiciously. "Whitmore didn't say anything to me about no meeting. Don't know anything about that, sir. Just delivering the message like I was told." For a moment, the overseer stood frozen, his drug-addled mind struggling to process this unexpected development. In that moment of hesitation, Caleb stepped out from his hiding place behind Harrow, while Moses emerged from the opposite direction. Harrow's head swiveled between them, and suddenly his pale eyes went wide with understanding. "You sons of bitches," he breathed. "You're planning something, planning to—" He never finished the sentence. Sarah's makeshift blackjack caught him across the temple with a sound like a melon hitting the ground. Harrow dropped to his knees, his ledger falling from nerveless fingers, but he wasn't unconscious. His pale eyes burned with rage and growing terror as the reality of his situation became clear. "Help!" He tried to shout, but his voice came out as little more than a croak. The herbs had relaxed his throat muscles along with everything else. Caleb was on him in an instant, clamping a hand over the overseer's mouth while Moses moved in with the rope. Harrow struggled, but his movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. The three of them had little trouble wrestling him into position beneath the waiting noose. "Time for you to get a taste of your own medicine," Moses said as he slipped the rope around Harrow's neck. "Time for you to learn what it feels like to be helpless." But even as they prepared to spring their trap, the very air around them began to change. The cotton dust that filled the storage area started to swirl and eddy as if stirred by invisible hands. The wooden beams creaked and groaned despite the absence of any wind. And from somewhere far below, or perhaps far above, came the sound of voices singing in languages that belonged to the dead. The supernatural forces they had been courting all week were finally awakening, drawn by the scent of approaching violence and the promise of justice too long delayed. Harrow's eyes went wide with a terror that transcended his immediate physical predicament. He could feel it too, the presence of something vast and hungry stirring in the shadows between worlds. What dark powers had they truly awakened in their quest for justice? And once unleashed, would these ancient forces be content with claiming just one life? The moment of reckoning had arrived, but the true horror was only beginning to unfold. If you're on the edge of your seat wondering how this supernatural revenge will play out, Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments. Do you think they're making a terrible mistake? Or is this the justice that the land has been crying out for? The climax is coming, and it's going to be more horrifying than you can imagine. The trap was set. The prey was caught. But in calling upon powers older than memory, the three conspirators were about to discover that some hunger could never be satisfied, and some debts demanded payment in currencies more terrible than blood. The moment the noose settled around Ezekiel Harrow's neck, the very fabric of reality seemed to tear. The air in the cotton storage barn became thick as molasses, charged with an electricity that made their skin crawl and their hair stand on end. From the pressed cotton bales surrounding them came a sound like whispered prayers, or perhaps curses, in languages that predated the arrival of white men to Tennessee. Harrow's pale eyes bulged with terror as he felt the rope against his throat. But it wasn't the fear of death that made him tremble. It was the growing awareness that something vast and hungry had awakened in response to their actions. The very cotton around them seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and shadows moved between the bales that had nothing to do with the dim light filtering through the barn's high windows. "Do it quick," Moses urged, his ancient hands shaking as he gripped the rope. "Can't you feel it? Something's coming, something old and angry." But Sarah held up a hand, her eyes closed in concentration. The small corn-husk doll from her grandmother's collection was clutched against her chest, and her lips moved in silent incantation. When she opened her eyes, they reflected an inner light that had nothing to do with the earthly illumination around them. "No," she said quietly. "Not quick. He needs to understand. We need to feel what we've felt all these years." The cotton bales around them had begun to shift and settle, as if the building itself was rearranging its contents. But Caleb realized with growing horror that the movement wasn't random. The bales were forming a circle around them, creating an arena where ancient justice would finally be served. Harrow tried to speak, but only strangled sounds emerged from his constricted throat. The herbs Sarah had given him were wearing off, replaced by a different kind of paralysis, the supernatural weight of accumulated guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. "You remember young Timothy?" Sarah asked conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "Boy you beat near death 2 days ago for the crime of being tired? He's still feverish in the quarters, probably won't see another sunrise thanks to you." She gestured, and somehow impossibly, one of the cotton bales moved on its own, sliding across the wooden floor with a grinding sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. It positioned itself directly behind Harrow, cutting off any possibility of retreat. "And Rebecca's little girl, the one you sold off to the slave traders last month because you said she was getting too uppity?" "She was only 12 years old, Harrow." 12. Another bale moved, this one from the left, closing off that avenue of escape. The rope around Harrow's neck seemed to tighten of its own accord, and his face was beginning to turn purple. "All those years of pain," Moses added, his voice taking on the rhythm of an old spirit. "All those tears soaked into this Tennessee soil. All that blood crying out for justice that never came." The supernatural presence in the barn was growing stronger. The very air shimmered with heat waves that had nothing to do with the summer temperature, and from somewhere far away, or perhaps very close, came the sound of singing. Voices raised in harmonies that belonged to the spirit world. Voices of the dead calling for retribution. "But here's the thing about justice delayed," Sarah continued, and now the corn-husk doll in her hands was glowing with a sickly phosphorescent light. "When it finally comes, it comes with interest." The cotton bales began moving faster now, sliding across the floor with purpose and intelligence. They formed tighter and tighter circles around the group, creating walls of compressed fiber that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. And in those white walls, faces began to appear, the faces of the dead, of everyone who had suffered under Harrow's cruelty. Harrow's struggles became more frantic as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just murder. This was something far more terrible. The very cotton that had been the source of his power was turning against him, animated by forces that had been building for generations. "Please," he managed to gasp, the first word he'd been able to speak since the noose went around his neck. "Please, Please?" Caleb's voice carried a coldness that surprised even him. That's funny, Harrow. Don't remember you being too interested in pleas when you were breaking bones and splitting backs. The circle of cotton bales had closed completely now, forming walls that stretched from floor to ceiling. They were trapped inside a chamber of white death, and the very air was becoming difficult to breathe. But somehow, impossibly, more cotton kept appearing, loose fibers that drifted down from above like snow, accumulating on the floor and beginning to rise. The earth remembers, Sarah said, and her voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Every drop of blood, every tear, every scream that's soaked into this soil. It's all been stored up, waiting for this moment. The loose cotton was ankle-deep now, and still it kept falling. But this wasn't ordinary cotton. It was black-veined, shot through with dark fibers that writhed like living things. Where it touched Harrow's skin, it seemed to burn, and he screamed, as the supernatural cotton began climbing his legs like searching tentacles. This is how it ends for men like you, Moses said, and his voice had taken on the authority of an Old Testament prophet. Buried alive in the very crop that built your power. Suffocated by the white gold that you valued more than human life. Cotton was waist-deep now, and Harrow's screams had become muffled as the fibers worked their way into his mouth and nose. But his eyes, his pale, terrified eyes, remained visible above the rising white tide, wide with the understanding of his fate. Can you feel them? Sarah asked, leaning close to his face. All the spirits you helped create? They're here, Harrow, waiting to drag you down to whatever hell is reserved for men like you. The supernatural cotton continued its relentless rise. But it wasn't just covering Harrow, it was entering him, filling his lungs and throat, mummifying him alive in white death. His struggles grew weaker as the fibers worked their way into every cavity, every pore, transforming him into something that was part human, part vegetable matter. But the most horrifying part was that he remained conscious through it all. The supernatural nature of his burial ensured that he would experience every moment of his entombment, would feel every fiber as it claimed another piece of his body. The singing voices were louder now, filling the chamber with harmonies that belonged to no earthly choir. The faces in the cotton walls were clearer too. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, all the victims of slavery's cruelty stretching back generations. They watched Harrow's burial with expressions of grim satisfaction, finally witnessing justice served. This is just the beginning, Sarah whispered as the cotton reached Harrow's chin. Death ain't the end for men like you. Death is just the doorway to a longer punishment. The overseer's eyes rolled wildly as the white tide covered his mouth, leaving only his nose exposed. The three conspirators stood in a small, clear space that the supernatural cotton seemed to avoid, witnesses to a justice that transcended mere human revenge. The old spirits are hungry, Moses observed, watching as the last of Harrow disappeared beneath the white surface. They've been patient for so long, waiting for someone to open the door between worlds. But now that door's open, and they want their due. For several minutes, the surface of the cotton continued to roil and shift as Harrow's final struggles played out beneath. Then, gradually, it settled into an unnatural stillness that was somehow more disturbing than the movement had been. Is he dead? Caleb asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Dead? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Oh no, that would be too kind. He's buried, but he ain't dead. The cotton's keeping him alive down there, feeding him. Just enough air to keep breathing. Just enough space to feel every moment of his imprisonment. The implication hit Caleb like a physical blow. You mean he's still conscious? Still aware? Forever, Moses confirmed grimly. That's the curse Sarah called down. Eternal burial, eternal suffocation, eternal awareness of his fate. A punishment that fits the crime. As if in response to their words, the surface of the cotton began to pulse rhythmically, the heartbeat of something that was no longer entirely human. And from deep within that white tomb came a sound that made their blood freeze. The muffled scream of a man discovering that death was not the worst thing that could happen to him. The supernatural presence in the barn was beginning to fade now. That justice had been served, but the three conspirators knew that what they had unleashed could never be completely contained. The door between worlds had been opened, and some things could never be closed again. "We need to get out of here," Caleb said, eyeing the walls of cotton bales that still surrounded them, "before someone comes looking." But even as he spoke, the bales began to shift again, creating an opening that led back to the barn's main floor. The supernatural forces that had aided their revenge were now helping them escape, ensuring that their secret would remain hidden. They climbed down from the upper level in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had done. The main floor of the barn looked exactly as it had before. No signs of struggle, no evidence of the horror that had just unfolded above. "His ledger," Sarah said suddenly. "We need to take it. Make it look like he just walked away." Caleb found the leather-bound book where Harrow had dropped it and tucked it inside his shirt. They would burn it later, along with any other evidence of the overseer's final inspection. As they prepared to leave the barn, Moses paused and looked back toward the upper level. "You think we did right?" he asked quietly. Sarah's expression was hard as flint. "We did what needed to be done, nothing more, nothing less." But even as she spoke the words, they could all hear it. The distant sound of muffled screaming from somewhere above, where a man who had dealt death was learning what it meant to live forever in a grave of his own making. They slipped out of the barn and returned to their duties, playing their roles as ignorant field hands with Oscar-worthy skill. But each of them carried the knowledge of what they had done, and each of them wondered if they had saved their people or doomed them, all. Above them, the storm clouds finally began to break, sending the first drops of rain in weeks to fall on the Tennessee soil. But the rain that fell was not clear. It was tinged with red, as if the very sky was weeping blood for the justice that had finally been served. In the cotton storage barn, something that had once been a man continued its eternal struggle against suffocation, while the spirits of the dead sang lullabies that would last until the end of time. The weight of summer had finally lifted, but what it had revealed beneath was far more terrible than any heat wave could ever be. 3 weeks had passed since Ezekiel Harrow's disappearance, and the Whitmore plantation had settled into an uneasy rhythm under the watchful eye of its new overseer. Benedict Crawford was a different breed of man entirely, careful, methodical, and notably less inclined toward casual violence. He carried a Bible in his coat pocket and actually seemed to read it, though whether from genuine faith or simple pragmatism none could say. But the absence of Harrow's particular brand of cruelty had not brought peace to the Tennessee cotton fields. If anything, the atmosphere had grown more oppressive, charged with an undercurrent of supernatural dread that made even the livestock nervous. Caleb worked his rows in the pre-dawn darkness, grateful for Crawford's more reasonable work schedules, but unable to shake the feeling that something was watching him from the shadows between the cotton plants. The black bolls had not disappeared with Harrow's death. If anything, they had multiplied, forming intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. The muffled screaming had started the second night after their act of vengeance. It came from the direction of the cotton storage barn, barely audible but unmistakably human, a sound of such despair and terror that it made strong men weep and caused the plantation's dogs to howl in sympathetic anguish. Crawford had investigated twice, finding nothing but neatly stacked cotton bales and the lingering scent of something that reminded him unpleasantly of grave dirt. "You hear it again last night?" Sarah whispered as she passed Caleb's row, her basket heavy with cotton that seemed to writhe and squirm when touched. "Every night," he replied quietly. "Getting louder, too, like he's trying to claw his way out." But they both knew that escape was impossible. The supernatural cotton that held Harrow was not bound by earthly laws, and the justice it represented was both eternal and absolute. Still, the knowledge that their tormentor suffered somewhere beneath their feet provided little comfort when that suffering made itself known through endless, muffled screams. Moses had taken to spending his nights in prayer, but the words that came from his lips were not entirely Christian. The old African spirits his grandmother had whispered about were awake now, stirring in response to the blood sacrifice they had been offered. They were grateful for Harrow's punishment, but they were also hungry for more. "The door's open now," Moses had confided to Sarah the previous evening as they watched the sun set over the cotton fields. Can't close it again, even if we wanted to. What we started 3 weeks ago, it's bigger than just Harrow now. He was right. Strange things had begun happening throughout the plantation. Tools moved on their own. Shadows fell in directions that defied the sun's position. The well water had taken on a reddish tint that no amount of cleaning could remove. And in the slave quarters, children spoke of seeing figures in the fields at night, tall, dark shapes that moved through the cotton rows with purpose and intelligence. Master Whitmore himself had begun to show signs of strain. The man who had once strutted through his domain with the confidence of absolute authority now jumped at unexpected sounds and rarely ventured out after dark. His wife had taken to her bed with a nervous condition that the family doctor attributed to the summer heat, though those who knew better recognized the symptoms of supernatural dread. Crawford proved to be a more perceptive man than his predecessor. Within a week of his arrival, he had begun carrying iron nails in his pockets and wearing a small silver cross that his grandmother had given him. He treated the enslaved workers with careful respect, but his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, as if expecting attack from an enemy he couldn't quite identify. "Something ain't right here," he confided to Master Whitmore during one of their evening meetings. "The very air feels wrong, like something's been stirred up that should have been left sleeping." Whitmore had dismissed such concerns as superstitious nonsense, but privately he was beginning to wonder if his previous overseer's sudden disappearance had been less voluntary than it appeared. Harrow's personal effects remained untouched in the overseer's quarters, and his horse still waited in the stable, growing more agitated with each passing day. The cotton harvest had begun, but the work proceeded slowly and with obvious reluctance. The pressed bales that came from the gin house were shot through with black fibers that no amount of processing could remove, and merchants were beginning to complain about the quality of Whitmore cotton. The plantation's reputation, built over decades, was crumbling along with its supernatural equilibrium. But it was Timothy's recovery that truly demonstrated the extent of the changes wrought by Harrow's burial. The boy who had been beaten nearly to death had not only survived his injuries but had begun displaying abilities that defied explanation. He spoke of seeing the overseer's spirit wandering the fields at night, trapped between worlds and growing more desperate with each passing hour. "He can't find his way to either heaven or hell," Timothy explained to a gathering of workers in Moses's cabin. "The cotton's got hold of him and it ain't letting go. But he's getting stronger, learning how to push back against what's holding him." This news troubled even Sarah, whose grandmother's knowledge had made their revenge possible. She had assumed that Harrow's burial would be the end of their troubles, not the beginning of something far more dangerous. "The old spirits are pleased with what we did," she admitted during one of their clandestine meetings. "But they want more. They've tasted justice after so many years of waiting, and now they're hungry for a full reckoning." "What kind of reckoning?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "All of it," Moses replied grimly. "Every white man who ever raised a hand against us. Every master who ever sold a child away from its mother. Every overseer who ever felt the whip was the answer to every problem." The implications of this were staggering. If the supernatural forces they had awakened decided to expand their definition of justice, no white person on the plantation would be safe. The very power they had used to destroy Harrow could easily turn against them all, creating a bloodbath that would make their individual act of revenge look like child's play. "We have to stop it," Caleb said. "Find some way to put the spirits back to sleep before they decide we're all guilty by association." But Sarah shook her head. "You can't put the ocean back in a bottle once you've opened the cork. What's done is done. All we can do now is try to survive what's coming." As if summoned by her words, the muffled screaming from the direction of the barn grew suddenly louder, more insistent. It was joined by other sounds, the creaking of wood under enormous pressure, the whisper of cotton fibers moving against each other, and something else. Something that sounded almost like laughter. Crawford appeared at the door of Moses's cabin, his face pale and his hands trembling. "You folks hear that?" "Yes, sir," Moses replied carefully. "We hear it. Any idea what might be causing such a sound?" The three conspirators exchanged glances, each aware that their secret balanced on a knife's edge. But before anyone could respond, Timothy spoke up from his corner of the cabin. "It's Mr. Harrow," the boy said simply. "He's buried alive in the cotton barn and he's getting stronger every night. Soon he's going to break free, and when he does, he's going to want revenge on everyone who put him there." Crawford's face went white as parchment. That's impossible. Harrow disappeared weeks ago. Could be anywhere by now." "No, sir," Timothy continued with the calm certainty of someone who had seen beyond the veil between worlds. "He's right here. Been here all along. And the cotton's been keeping him alive, feeding on his hatred and growing stronger. But the spirits that put him there are getting restless. They want more blood, more justice. They want to settle accounts that go back generations." As if to emphasize the boy's words, a new sound drifted across the plantation. The distant tolling of a bell that shouldn't exist, calling the dead to some dark communion. In the cotton fields, the black bowls began to glow with their own phosphorescent light, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Crawford crossed himself and backed toward the door. I need to speak with Master Whitmore. This ain't natural. Ain't right." After he left, the conspirators sat in stunned silence. Their secret was out, but somehow that seemed like the least of their problems. The supernatural forces they had awakened were moving beyond their control, and the consequences were spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. "How long before he breaks free?" Sarah asked Timothy. The boy's eyes rolled back in his head for a moment as if consulting with invisible advisors. When he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that belonged to the spirit world. "Soon. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. But when he comes, he won't be human anymore. He'll be something else, something hungry and angry and powerful." Outside, the unnatural bell continued its tolling, and the cotton field swayed in patterns that defied the evening wind. The harvest of vengeance was ripening, but none of them could predict what form the final crop would take. As night fell, over the Whitmore plantation, Caleb found himself standing at the edge of the cotton fields, staring toward the barn where their act of justice had set in motion forces beyond human comprehension. Somewhere in that building, Ezekiel Harrow continued his eternal struggle against suffocation, growing stronger and more inhuman with each passing hour. But Harrow was no longer the greatest threat they faced. The old spirits that had aided their revenge were awake and hungry, and they had their own ideas about how justice should be served. The door between worlds had been opened, and what came through might be far worse than anything they had sought to destroy. In the distance, thunder rumbled without the promise of rain, and the very earth seemed to pulse with a heartbeat that belonged to something vast and terrible, stirring in the depths of the Tennessee soil. The weight of summer had lifted, but autumn promised a harvest of horrors that would make their individual act of vengeance look like mercy itself. And so ends our tale of supernatural justice in the cotton fields of Tennessee. But some stories never truly end. They simply wait in the darkness, ready to be discovered by those brave enough to listen. The spirits that Caleb, Sarah, and Moses awakened that summer continue to walk the earth, seeking their own form of justice. For centuries of accumulated wrongs, what do you think? Was their revenge justified, or did they unleash something that should have remained buried? Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. But remember, some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And somewhere in Tennessee, the cotton still grows black under summer moons and the dead still sing their songs of vengeance. Sweet dreams.